Hi, I'm Rob Clementi from Television Education Network. Allan Swan is from Estate Planning Equation and is one of Australia's best-known estate planning and tax advisors. For this week's Tax Bites, Allan joins us to discuss ATO's recent release on unpaid present entitlements.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. The ATO is focusing on legislation that was introduced in the 1980s. The ATO has tended not to do much about it. And suddenly now with this Practical Compliance Guide 2022/D1, they've all of a sudden taken a very strong view on what they feel is the scope of that provision. And so it's something that is probably there. If you have a look at the legislation, they're probably warranted in doing so, but it's something that has been surprising that it's taken this long for them to come to this sort of viewpoint. So what have they said? They've said that when you make an allocation to a beneficiary and you don't distribute it to that beneficiary, then they'll view those unpaid present entitlements as basically being a loan. They'll be saying that the money's sitting there and they'll be looking at ways to work out who the real beneficiary is. So with Section 100A, what they're looking for is any indication that someone other than the nominated beneficiary has received the benefit of that money. So if, by way of an example, we have money allocated to a beneficiary, we use that money to pay for that beneficiary's uni fees, there's no Section 100A worry, because even though the parent might have paid those uni fees, the bill for those uni fees would have come to the child, and the parent choosing to pay for the child's uni fees via a trust distribution is what I describe as, and what the legislation describes as, an ordinary family dealing. So in that situation, not a concern. To give you a second example where it's the other way around, quite often when we're looking at a client and we're looking at the unpaid present entitlements, the client says, can we get rid of those unpaid present entitlements? Can we gift them back to the trustee, or can we gift them to the parents or whatever? The moment that gift occurs, we're at risk. We're at risk of the tax office concluding that this isn't an ordinary family dealing. Instead, it's a non-commercial, out of the ordinary dealing, and the tax office will be seeking to invoke Section 102. So the reimbursement arrangement provisions, as they're often called. So it's a big change. So what we really need to be doing is, as we're deciding whether or not to do an allocation of income to a beneficiary, just checking as to whether we're able to say that sooner or later that actual beneficiary will benefit from that allocation. It might be immediately, it might take a year, it might take 2 years, but sooner or later that benefit will pass to the beneficiary. And what the ATO is also interested is to find out what happens to that unpaid present entitlement in the meantime. Is it going to be sitting there, not deriving any benefit for the beneficiary, or is it invested and the beneficiary gets a return on that investment? So all those sort of indicators are going to be particularly important as well. So it's a big change. It's really a new attitude on the part of the ATO. Probably has some significant standing, although we might see some court cases which might help us to find out whether the courts agree with the ATO. But in the meantime, we're running the risk, and the Practical Compliance Guide is interesting because it's got color coding in its measures. And if you get a green light, but the ATO is basically saying we're happy that you're not breaching Section 102. If you get a red light or an amber light, the ATO isn't happy with what you're doing. And so you need to score yourself to find out whether or not you get the appropriate light or whatever. We're also seeing a similar green light, red light approach in relation to professional practices, and that'll come in as of 1 July 2022. So I'm starting to guess that the ATO will be asking you in your tax returns to indicate what sort of light you've given yourself in terms of preparing that return in respect of these trust distributions.
Very interesting, Allan. Thank you very much for talking us through all of that. You're right about the traffic light system. It's a new approach. And if you want to learn more about Section 100A reimbursement agreements and the Commissioner's recent announcements, and most importantly, if you want to hear more from Allan Swan, check out our website because there's lots of programs that Allan has done for us. He's one of our regular presenters.